A wave of disappearances shocks a small town. It was the sweltering heat of July 2018 when the first hint of something deeply unsettling began to ripple through the quiet, unassuming town of Millhaven, nestled in the heartland of America's Midwest. For generations, Millhaven had been the very picture of Americana, a place where everyone seemed to know everyone. The corner diner doubled as the town's gossip hub, and kids pedaled their bikes down winding streets flanked by endless fields of corn. Neighbors greeted one another with warm smiles, security was a given, and nothing bad ever happened here. Something out of a true crime podcast, as the locals would later grimly admit, felt like a world away. Then, Maria Vasquez vanished. Maria, a 34-year-old Mexican immigrant with no official documentation but a reputation as one of the hardest-working women in town, disappeared without a trace one mundane summer evening. She had left her modest apartment above the laundromat with a hopeful gleam in her eyes, wearing her best blouse and clutching a folder of resumes. Her roommate, Luz, recalled that Maria had been looking forward to meeting a potential employer at the town's bustling labor market. "She said this guy sounded nice," Luz later told investigators, her voice faltering. "Friendly, like, maybe, just maybe, this could be the one good thing that happens for her in Millhaven." But Maria never came home. Her phone, the lifeline she used to stay connected with her worried family back in Veracruz, stopped ringing. Her aging mother left desperate voicemails every night, heartfelt messages begging her to call back, filled with nervous laughter and prayers she could barely finish. And at first, no one beyond Luz seemed particularly alarmed. After all, in towns like Millhaven, adults sometimes left without explanation. But Luz's growing unease soon turned into outright fear. Something about the way Maria had been so full of hope, so eager for this new job, it didn't align with her vanishing willingly. Luz went to the Millhaven Police Department, but her plea wasn't met with the urgency she'd hoped for. An officer jotted down a brief statement, yawned through her recounting of the events, and folded it neatly into a drawer. "We'll let you know if anything comes up," he said, with the dry indifference of someone who had seen far too many missing person cases involving people with no legal status, and even fewer tangible results. "Sometimes people decide to start over somewhere new," he added dismissively, as if this was the explanation Luz should accept. But what Luz didn't know then, and what no one in Millhaven realized, was that Maria Vasquez was just the first. In the weeks that followed, whispers began circulating of other women disappearing under eerily similar circumstances. There was Teresa Mendoza, a single mother who worked extra shifts cleaning houses in the upscale neighborhoods on the edge of town. She had canceled plans with a friend, saying she had a promising job interview lined up with a man who sounded like the real deal. Then one Tuesday morning she was gone. Her car left abandoned at a gas station just off Route 41, her personal belongings still sitting neatly inside. Reports trickled in slowly but steadily. Esperanza Ruiz, a nanny who tended to a senator's summer home. Ana Gutierrez, a widow who had just started working as a cook at the Millhaven diner. One by one, women like Maria, mostly immigrants, mostly undocumented, all vulnerable in ways few wanted to acknowledge, vanished, leaving behind scared friends, frantic family members, and troubling questions that no one seemed eager to ask aloud. The disappearances weren't instantaneous bombshells. Like so many tragedies in quiet towns, they began as small ripples. Stories whispered at church potlucks, rumors exchanged during Sunday brunches at Millhaven's Lone Cafe. The pattern was impossible to ignore if one dared to look closely. These were not random episodes of wanderers choosing new horizons. No, the women who vanished were often the kind who had everything to lose by leaving, and nothing to gain. Local employers spoke gruffly about how it was only a matter of time before they skipped town anyway. Some neighbors shrugged off the disappearances with statements like, "Well, you know these kinds of folks, transient lifestyles." These remarks were a grim reflection of how prejudice often worked silently to cloud judgment. Among the immigrant community, though, paranoia reached a fever pitch. WhatsApp groups buzzed with warnings about job offers that were too good to be true. Word spread about a man in his 50s with a calm demeanor and a battered pickup truck who'd been seen lingering around the labor market. He wouldn't hurt a fly, some described him. Too polite to seem dangerous, others reasoned. But the coincidences were too stark to ignore anymore. Women were drawn to him, charmed by how he spoke quietly but warmly, offering well-paying jobs and flexible hours. Yet once they took his offer, they simply vanished. By late August, the sparse coverage of these incidents had caught the attention of local journalist Rachel Monroe, who worked for Millhaven's only newspaper, the Herald. Her first article, boldly titled, "Missing Women of Millhaven, Is There a Pattern?" hit the town like a hurricane. It questioned the lack of involvement from local law enforcement and challenged the townsfolk's seeming apathy. In her piece, Monroe wrote, "It's convenient for us to believe these disappearances are coincidences. Easier too. But we owe it to these women to demand answers. Because if not us, who?" For the first time in decades, the pristine illusion of Millhaven cracked. The town's peaceful image had been scarred, leaving a growing shadow that hung over the community. And though most hoped it was nothing, knew they might be overthinking, deep down, everyone began asking the same question. What if someone, or something, is hunting them down? The first clue. Long before the puzzle of disappearances in Millhaven began to truly unravel, the first piece of the mystery slipped into the hands of law enforcement almost unnoticed. It wasn't a dramatic revelation, nor was it the result of a determined investigation. Instead, it came from a young man named Diego Vasquez, stepping into the town's poorly lit police station one balmy evening in late July. Diego was only 22, wearing oil-stained jeans and a faded shirt from the construction site where he worked double shifts just to make ends meet. His sneakers scuffed against the station's cracked linoleum floor as he approached the desk. Officer Hale, a weary man in his 50s, didn't even glance up as he lazily twisted a styrofoam coffee cup in his hands. "How can I help you?" Hale muttered, the cigarette tucked behind his ear wobbling slightly as he spoke. Diego hesitated. He didn't have much faith in small-town cops, not as someone whose family had lived in the shadow of ICE raids and fake social security numbers for as long as he could remember. But this wasn't about him. It was about Maria, his mother. I need to report a missing person," Diego stammered. That sentence finally got Hale's attention. The officer leaned back in his chair, his curiosity piqued just enough to put his coffee cup down. "All right, let's hear it. Who's missing?" "It's my mom," Diego said, his voice cracking slightly under the weight of worry he tried to conceal. "Maria Vasquez. She hasn't come home in over a week." Hale sighed, exhaling a long breath as if he'd just been handed a tedious chore. He grabbed a clipboard and pen, motioning for Diego to take a seat. "Okay, how old is she?" 34, Diego said quickly, sitting down on the edge of the wooden chair. "She's been looking for work recently. House cleaning or, babysitting. Whatever she could find." Hale jotted this down without much thought. "She married?" "No, it's just her and me. She raised me on her own all these years. We don't have any other family here." "Where was the last place you saw her?" Hale continued, his tone steady but disinterested. "She left our apartment on Birch Street," Diego answered, glancing nervously at the paint peeling off the station's walls. "She said she had a job lead. A guy she met at the labor market who promised good hours, good pay." Hale froze for just a fraction of a second before resuming his notes. "This guy," he said languidly, making air quotes. "Any details about him?" "No, not really," Diego admitted with a frustrated sigh. "She just said he seemed nice, trustworthy." Hale didn't suppress his scoff this time. He leaned back in his chair again, letting the clipboard drop onto the desk. "Diego, look, I've been in this business long enough to tell you, sometimes people, especially adults, just up and leave. Your mother probably wanted to start fresh somewhere, maybe even send you money back when she's settled." "No," Diego said sharply, shaking his head. "You don't understand my mom. She wouldn't walk away, not without telling me. She wouldn't just disappear like this." "Has she been in trouble with anyone?" Haley asked, ignoring Diego's pleading tone. "Dealing with stuff you might not know about? Debt? Trouble back home?" "No, she only has a couple of $1,000s saved. There's nothing to run from." Diego clenched his fists. "She even left her phone behind. It's been off this whole time. She wouldn't do that. That phone it's how she talks to her mom back in Mexico." By now, Hale was tired of the conversation. Stories like this weren't uncommon in Millhaven, a transient town known for its migrant laborers. People came through with nothing, and they often left with the same. He didn't have the time or the resources for what he assumed was just another migrant adult ghosting her family. "Look, kid," Hale said, standing up and stretching as he signaled the conversation was over. "I'll file your report, all right? But I wouldn't get your hopes up. People move on. No crime in that." "She didn't move on!" Diego stood, his voice shaking with frustration but trying not to yell. "She was excited about this job, hopeful. You don't—" "Stop!" Hale held up his hand, trying to quiet the young man. "We'll let you know if anything pops up. Best thing you can do now is get on with your life. People come back when they're ready." Diego was fuming, but what could he do? He grabbed the crumpled police report copy Hale shoved at him and stormed out of the station. The warm wind whipped at his face as he trudged back home, memories of his mother's bright smile flashing in his mind. Over the next few days, Diego plastered the town with missing flyers, Maria's familiar photo staring blankly out at gas stations, telephone poles, and diner windows. But no one called. No one even seemed to notice. What Diego didn't know was that someone had noticed. Somewhere downtown, a woman sitting 2 booths over from Diego's flyers crumpled a napkin nervously in her hand. Teresa Mendoza, another housekeeper, recognized her own story in Diego's pain. Kind stranger, tempting job offer, a pickup truck that had haunted her memories ever since. Her hands trembled as she debated whether to call attention to it, but Teresa never went to the police. 2 days later, she disappeared too. The similar victims. At first, the disappearances seemed random, scattered across the quiet stretches of Millhaven, but as whispers turned into hushed conversations and worried glances, the thread tying the victims together began to unravel, exposing a sinister pattern lurking beneath the surface. Local news barely reported the initial cases, just a brief mention buried in the community section about Maria Vasquez, a temporary resident who had gone missing. For the daily rush of commuters and townsfolk concerned primarily with keeping their own heads above water, it didn't seem out of place. People left Millhaven quietly all the time, especially the kind of people society preferred not to notice. But then came Teresa Mendoza. Teresa wasn't the type to leave without warning. She was a single mother, fiercely devoted to her 8-year-old daughter, Nina. Teresa worked long shifts cleaning big glass-paneled houses in the upscale part of town, doing anything to ensure her daughter had opportunities she herself never had. Her friends described her as cautious to a fault. "I remember she called me," said Gabriela Hernandez, a neighbor who often watched Nina after school. She was excited because she said this new job offer sounded almost too good to be true. A man approached her at the labor market and told her he needed help running a summer home for a family. The pay was higher than anything she could have dreamed of. Gabriela's lips trembled as she remembered the last thing Teresa had said to her. "Maybe this will finally be my break, Gabby. Maybe I can send Nina to summer camp this year." But Teresa never came back. Her car was found abandoned on the side of Route 41, a small, aging sedan with a cracked windshield and a Nina-shaped car seat in the back. Her purse, with its neatly folded receipts and a worn wallet, was left untouched on the passenger seat. There were no signs of a struggle, no clues pointing to where she had gone. Next was Esperanza Ruiz, then Ana Gutierrez, and then others. Their lives, which already existed on the fringes of the town's attention, began to fade entirely. Esperanza was a live-in nanny for a senator's summer home on the outskirts of Millhaven. Anna had recently started working part-time as a cook at the local diner. Their disappearances shared no obvious connections at the time, different ages, jobs, even personalities. The only tangible link? All of them were immigrant women, predominantly undocumented, who had come to Millhaven chasing a fragile dream of stability. For those who dared to pull at the threads, the similarities between the missing became increasingly apparent, and increasingly hard to ignore. They weren't the type to just walk away, said Rachel Monroe, a reporter for the Small-Town Herald. She had begun independently cataloging the missing women after noticing a troubling trend. Every single one of them had people who depended on them. They were single mothers, caretakers. They didn't just leave. Most of them didn't even have the resources to leave if they wanted to. What added to the chilling pattern was that each victim had been approached in public under seemingly harmless circumstances. Job offers, promises of good wages, casual trust extended in the most innocuous ways, and each trusted the wrong person. One thread connecting their disappearances was the Millhaven Day labor market. The open-air strip behind the general store where desperate workers lined up at dawn was a mix of hope and exhaustion. People showed up with paint-splattered jeans, weathered hands, and the quiet resolve to take anything offered. "Sometimes you'd see the same faces over and over," said Daniel Cruz, who frequently waited at the market for construction work. "But then, they'd disappear, and no one would really ask questions. Maria, I remember seeing her smiling that morning. She said she finally had good news. But after that, nothing. It scares me, man, because I was standing right there. It could have been any of us." The fear began spreading like wildfire, but no one seemed to know what to do with it. Workers started warning each other about job offers that promised too much, or seemed too perfect. What initially seemed like coincidences, women leaving town for better opportunities, began to feel like carefully calculated traps. "I don't know," Cruz said, ruffling his hair nervously. "There's this guy. Everyone notices him. He drives this beat-up gray pickup truck, nothing fancy. He's got this way about him, calm, quiet, doesn't stand out too much. Almost like he's practiced not standing out, and he only ever talks to... well, he mostly talks to the women. You kind of assume he's harmless, you know? But now I wonder. There was a description, fuzzy but consistent among the few lingering witnesses. Mid-50s male, gray hair that curled slightly at the edges, always kept neat. A truck that rattled but never seemed to break down. Most notably, a calm, deliberate demeanor that made everyone believe, if only briefly, that whatever opportunity he dangled in front of them could be trusted. "I saw him park out back one morning," said Rosa, who had worked in Millhaven for over a decade. She pulled her jacket tighter around herself as if fighting off the memory. "He looked kind, quiet, offered Esperanza a job, talked real sweet about how easy it'd be. She said yes. I told her not to trust strangers, but she laughed it off, said he seemed so nice." Rosa's voice cracked. "You have to understand. When you have so little, it's easy to believe one good thing will finally happen. For those in Millhaven, particularly among the immigrant community, the disappearances became a shared paranoia. WhatsApp group chats lit up with frantic discussions, warnings, and rumors. Neighbors spied on unfamiliar vehicles out of habit. Mothers working odd hours had someone else accompany them home as a precaution. Unfortunately, it was the rest of the town who seemed largely indifferent, or worse, scornful. Most of Millhaven's longtime residents avoided talking about it altogether. The missing were deemed other people's problems. No one wanted to face the hard truth. Something was methodically targeting the most vulnerable among them, and no one had stopped it. "Transient women," one neighbor muttered when asked by the Herald for comment. "It's just what happens sometimes. They leave, they change names. None of this is new. You don't see anyone going missing who's lived here for generations. Those women probably wanted out." But Rachel Monroe couldn't let it go. Every evening she pored over crime data, witness interviews, phone records, desperately combing for anything the police seemed to miss. These women weren't leaving. They were being taken. And Rachel was sure of one thing: if someone didn't connect the dots soon, others would disappear too. The unsettling pattern emerges for weeks. The talk of missing women haunted corners of Millhaven, whispered into steaming cups of coffee at the diner or murmured through the checkout line at the grocery store. At first, it was hard to pinpoint any connection, other than the eerie fact they were all women, all disappearing into thin air. It was only when Rachel Monroe, a relentless journalist for the Herald, began combing through her notes one sleepless night that the veil began to lift. She sat in her cramped home office, a tangle of sticky notes, maps, and printed articles pinned to the corkboard above her desk. Strings of red yarn connected names, dates, and locations like a scene straight out of a conspiracy theorist's lair. Maria Vasquez, Teresa Mendoza, Esperanza Ruiz, Ana Gutierrez. Rachel chewed on the end of her pencil as she muttered to herself, the hum of cicadas outside the window, her only company. "They don't fit until they do," she whispered, drawing a shaky red line between Maria's name and Teresa's. Each woman's story began to play out like a tragic melody in Rachel's mind. Maria, a hopeful immigrant, desperate to provide for her mother back in Mexico. Teresa, a struggling single mother working herself to the bone to give her daughter a brighter future. Esperanza, a reserved nanny who loved sending photos of Millhaven's fall foliage back to her siblings in Oaxaca. Ana, the quiet cook who charmed the regulars at the diner by remembering their usual orders. They were different in so many ways, ages, jobs, personalities, but Rachel couldn't ignore what bound them together. All of them were immigrants, all of them were undocumented, and all of them were vulnerable in ways most of the town refused to acknowledge. Rachel scribbled across her notepad. "Targeted, vulnerability =, common ground." "All right, Monroe, walk me through it," Rachel muttered to herself as she leaned back in her chair and stared at the growing web of connections. Who were they talking to? Where were they going? Her gaze kept circling back to one place, the Millhaven Day labor market. The dusty strip of pavement was nothing more than a makeshift lineup of hope and desperation. Men and women would gather there at dawn, their faces lined with fatigue and sun exposure, ready to jump at any opportunity, no matter how fleeting or suspicious. The wealthy families of Millhaven's outskirts often came by to look for gardeners, housekeepers, or nannies. The town had always taken this labor market for granted. Rachel herself hadn't noticed it much, except for the occasional detour she'd take to avoid the crowd when the market spilled onto Main Street. But now it loomed large in her mind, each of the women having mentioned it in passing days before their disappearances. She remembered one line from Luz, Maria Vasquez's roommate, during their brief interview. She said she'd met someone at the market, someone who promised her work as a housekeeper. He sounded so sincere, trustworthy. You think it's possible he... Luz hadn't even finished her sentence then. She'd shaken her head, her voice breaking, and sobbed into her hands instead. Rachel pulled up her last interview notes about Teresa Mendoza. She had been cleaning houses in the Hillstone neighborhood, home to Millhaven's wealthiest residents. Teresa had spoken to a neighbor about a man who approached her at the market, offering an hourly rate she could only dream of. He said the family needed help running a small home. I mean, it sounded so professional, Gabriela Hernandez had told Rachel. Gabriela's eyes filled with tears as she added, Teresa was so excited, she said, this could change everything. But now, she's gone, Rachel, just like Maria. The pattern didn't end there. Over and over, witnesses painted a similar picture. Different women, same kind of story. A well-spoken man who exuded calm, a seemingly legitimate job offer, a promise so alluring it was hard not to trust. There's this guy. Daniel Cruz, a construction worker who frequented the market, had said nervously during Rachel's interview. He twisted his baseball cap in his hands as he sat at the edge of his chair. He's hard to describe. Normal. Too normal, maybe. It's like he studied how to blend into the background, you know? Nothing flashy, just this regular middle-aged dude with gray hair and a beat-up truck. A truck? Rachel straightened in her seat, her pen poised. Yeah, this old gray Dodge, Daniel said. The kind you'd see on any farm out here. But the thing that gets me is how he only talks to the women. Like, I don't want to sound crazy, but I saw him there the same morning Maria disappeared. He was talking to her. Looked real friendly. Rachel leaned closer. And no one thought, this guy was suspicious? Daniel scratched at the bristles on his chin awkwardly. Well, not really. I mean, he didn't seem dangerous. Polite, quiet. Even helped this lady carry her bags once. That kind of thing puts people at ease, I guess. But now, I don't know. I keep thinking if I'd said something to Maria, maybe told her not to go with him, maybe... His voice trailed off, thick with guilt. The more Rachel spoke with witnesses, the more unnerving details emerged. Women described being approached by the same man. Mid-50s, gray hair curling ever so slightly above his collar, heavy-set, calm and deliberate in his mannerisms. He offered them well-paying jobs with flexible hours, spoke softly, and gave the impression of a man truly in need of help. Someone you could trust because he seemed so non-threatening. No one like him would hurt a fly, Rosa, a longtime laborer at the market, told Rachel. I remember he'd say those sweet words, you'll finally catch a break with me. Why wouldn't I believe that? Esperanza believed it too. And just like that, her voice cracked. Rachel rubbed at her temples as she pieced it all together late that night. This wasn't random. This wasn't bad luck. These women were being hunted and the predator knew exactly how to pick his prey. She scribbled again in her notebook, underlining the question twice. Who is he? Then she circled the answer she guessed deep down every frightened woman at the market already knew, even if they pretended not to. The man with the gray pickup. As Rachel stared at her corkboard, her stomach twisted. The pattern was there for anyone willing to look closely enough, but would the police? Or was it already too late for the next victim? The emergence of the suspect's identity. It was always there, lurking like a shadow in the corners of whispered conversations, an unspoken presence roaming unnoticed in Millhaven's busy streets. For weeks, the women of the immigrant community had been murmuring about the man. They didn't know his name or anything concrete about him, but his description, vague yet chilling, became a thread that tied the growing panic together. And for Rachel Monroe, whose corkboard of missing persons in her home office was becoming a labyrinth of unanswered questions, the man was no longer just a figment of speculation. He was real, and he had a purpose. For the first time, Rachel could feel the threads of this mystery tightening around a name, though it wasn't an official one. They call him Charles, said Rosa Morales, pausing to take a shaky sip from her coffee. The morning sun streamed through the diner window, illuminating Rosa's tired face. She had agreed, reluctantly, to meet Rachel in the early hours before the labor market filled with hopeful workers. Rosa sat hunched forward, her hands fidgeting nervously with a sugar packet. At least, that's what I've heard. Someone said he introduces himself that way. Charles something, but... Her voice faltered. But what? Rachel pressed gently. She jotted notes quickly, the spiral notebook in her lap already filled with bullet points and frantic underlines. It feels made up, Rosa confessed, shaking her head. Like one of those names you use when you don't want anyone to find you. You know? Rachel nodded, sensing how deeply Rosa's words spilled out of quiet fear. Okay, so, Charles, what else? Let's piece it together. Rosa hesitated, glancing around the diner. Only a few older customers gossiped softly in a nearby booth. The clinking of plates and the hiss of the coffee machine filled the silences between her words. She leaned closer, lowering her voice. He's older, Rosa began. Gray hair, you can't miss it. Not messy, though. It looks neat. Like the guy pays attention, you know? Keeps himself put together. Not scruffy or anything like that. He strikes people as responsible, trustworthy? Rachel asked, filling in the blanks. Yes, that, Rosa said, sitting back quickly as if Rachel had read her mind. It's the way he talks too. Soft-spoken, not in a creepy way, just like... maybe like a teacher or, I don't know, someone calm, someone polite. He makes you feel like you can trust him. Rachel tightened her grip on her pen. And you've seen him, yourself? Twice, Rosa said after a long pause. Both times at the market, early in the morning. He just blends in, you know? Walks around like he's no different from anyone else. One time I remember him talking to Maria. Rosa's lips trembled slightly. She looked so happy, Rachel. Like he'd offered her exactly what she needed. A good job, good money, a home away from this mess. Rachel had heard similar descriptions from other women at the labor market. Charles, or whoever he truly was, had a routine. Early mornings dressed plainly, driving his old gray pickup truck that rattled, but never seemed to falter. He approached only women, usually the younger ones, the hopeful ones. His targets weren't random, they were deliberate. He's good at finding who's vulnerable, Gabriela Hernandez had said, her voice tinged with anger at the memory. Gabriela's friend Teresa was one of the first victims to vanish. Man like him, he knows how to talk. He doesn't jump on you too fast. He pulls you in easy, like he's been doing this his whole life. A clearer image of this shadowed figure began to take shape when Rachel spoke with Diego Vasquez, Maria's grieving son. It had taken weeks to convince him to meet her. His initial anger at the lack of urgency from the cops had hardened him into silence, but Rachel's persistence finally wore him down. Diego's voice was low but steady as they sat on a park bench not far from his small apartment. She called me that day, you know, Diego murmured, his hands gripping his knees. Maria, not Mom. I always called her by her name, Maria. Said she was meeting someone for a housekeeping job. Told me he was older but nice. That's all I got when I asked. I thought she'd be okay. Rachel placed a comforting hand on his arm. You said older. Did she say how older? Not much, maybe 50, 55, something like that. Not a big guy, she said, average, but kind eyes. Diego's jaw flexed as his anger bubbled beneath the surface. Kind eyes, I hate myself for not asking more. I should have gone with her, I should have said something. It's not your fault, Rachel reassured him, though she knew the words provided little comfort to someone carrying that much guilt. Do you remember anything else? She mentioned a truck, Diego said after a moment, his voice quieter now. An old one, gray. She thought it looked harmless. And there it was, the gray truck. Rachel underlined it 3 times in her notebook. Truck drivers were a dime a dozen in Millhaven, but this one now stood out like a bullseye. Women at the labor market had mentioned it in whispers. Diego had confirmed it. And Rosa's story about seeing Charles drive off with Maria cemented it as the most critical detail. But just knowing it existed wasn't enough. Rachel needed more. She felt she was close to the heart of this terrifying enigma, but she needed something sharp enough to cut through the haze. And then, there was the unlikeliest breakthrough. One evening, Rachel received a frantic call from a woman she had given her number to weeks prior, a soft-spoken nanny named Marta. Marta had fled Millhaven with her sister after Maria's disappearance, fearing she might be next. But now, through the static of the phone line, Marta's voice trembled with urgency. Rachel, she whispered, covering the receiver like someone might overhear her. I remember something about Charles. It's not just the truck. Rachel sat up straight, every nerve alive with anticipation. What is it? He has a scar, Marta said quickly, on his hand, right here. She breathed into the phone, likely mimicking the motion across her palm. Deep scar. I only saw it when he handed Maria a piece of paper. He tried to hide it after that, like he didn't want anyone to notice. A scar, Rachel repeated, scribbling it down. Her pulse quickened. Okay, that's good, Marta. Anything else? He was always careful, Marta added. Careful, but not perfect. People who saw him, they thought he was different. Other men in the market are loud in a hurry. Him, he waits, watches, and Rachel... Marta's voice dropped to a near whisper. He doesn't fool everyone. Some of us knew he wasn't right, but by the time you notice, he's already chosen. Marta hung up before Rachel could say more. Through the details clawed together from frightened voices and reluctant witnesses, the identity of the suspect began to emerge. Charles Shepard, or whatever his real name might be, was more than just a polite middle-aged man with a gray truck and a scarred hand. He was calculating, he was patient, and above all he knew exactly how to blend in. The invisible predator of Millhaven was no longer shrouded in whispers. His face, the quiet menace behind the disappearances, was beginning to take form. All Rachel could wonder now was whether the town was willing to see it. A witness's shocking confession. It came out of nowhere. An accidental spark in a case that had grown ice-cold. Beneath the layers of fear and silence that engulfed Millhaven's immigrant community, someone finally stepped forward. But as Rachel Monroe sat across from the woman in the flickering light of the dingy coffee shop, she realized this wasn't just a confession. This was a crack in the invisible wall that had kept the town blindfolded for so long. She was in her mid-30s, with tired eyes and fingers that wouldn't stop trembling as they wrapped around a chipped coffee cup. To protect herself, she insisted Rachel refer to her only as Lucia, though Rachel suspected it wasn't her real name. For women like her, anonymity was a small shield in a world that didn't believe in keeping them safe. "I've been so scared," Lucia admitted, her voice low, barely above the hum of conversation around them, "but I couldn't hold it in anymore, especially not after I saw the last flyer, the one with Maria on it." Rachel leaned in, her notepad already open, pen poised with anticipation. "What did you see, Lucia? Tell me everything." Lucia's eyes darted around, checking the entrance, checking every diner booth. She kept clutching her cup as if someone might pry it from her hands. Her voice dropped even further, just a whisper Rachel had to strain to hear. "I worked for him once," she said finally. Rachel froze. "You worked for him? You mean Charles?" Lucia nodded quickly, her breathing shallow, her anxiety boiling just beneath her skin. "I didn't know his name at first," she began, her words like broken glass. "He told me it was Richard, or maybe Robert. I can't remember, it doesn't matter, but it's the same man. Gray hair, calm smile, the truck." She swallowed, trying to get the words out. "He came to the market one morning, said he needed a housekeeper. Something simple, a summer job for his cabin." Rachel jotted the details furiously. "And you agreed?" Lucia hesitated, biting her lip so hard it almost bled. "You don't understand," she said bitterly. "When you're undocumented, when you're just trying to survive, you don't have the luxury of saying no. He promised me fair pay, cash, more than anyone else had. And he said everything that sounded—" She hesitated, searching for the right words. "Safe." Rachel felt her heart sink. She'd heard this story 100 times over. Soft promises, illusions of security, and just enough kindness to disarm his victims. "What happened next?" Rachel asked gently. For a moment Lucia stared at her reflection in the coffee. She swallowed again, her throat visibly tightening. "He picked me up in his truck. I should have known something was wrong then. But I thought—" Her voice cracked like brittle glass. "I thought it was just me being paranoid." Rachel leaned closer, her voice soft but urgent. "Lucia, it's okay. Take your time." Lucia wiped at her cheeks with the sleeve of her jacket. "He took me to his house. Or, I think it was his house, a cabin outside town somewhere. The curtains were shut, the windows were boarded up. I thought that was strange. He told me it was because he was remodeling, but—" She inhaled sharply. "That's when it started to feel off." Rachel's pen hovered over the page, waiting for more. "What happened inside?" Lucia's hands trembled harder, but she pushed through. "He was kind at first," she admitted. "Almost unsettlingly kind. He made tea, he asked me about my family." Her voice dropped further, barely audible. "Then he gave me food." Rachel perked up. "Food?" Lucia blinked back tears, nodding. "Yes, it was a small bowl of soup. He said it was for my energy, that he liked to make sure people working for him were taken care of." Her lips tightened, her face paling at the memory. "But something was wrong with it." "What do you mean?" Rachel asked. "I started feeling it, after the first few bites," Lucia said. "My arms felt heavy, like I couldn't hold myself up. My vision blurred, and he just watched me, sat across from me and smiled while She paused, swallowing bile. "While I could barely move anymore." Rachel's grip on her pen tightened. "Are you saying he drugged you?" Lucia gave a shaky nod. "I don't know what it was, but it wasn't normal. He kept saying things like, 'Don't be scared, it'll make you feel better soon.' Like he wasn't doing anything wrong. Like it was normal." Her voice cracked, louder now. I panicked. I didn't know what to do." Rachel felt the weight of the words between them. "How did you get out of there?" Lucia glanced toward the exit like she needed to confirm it was still there. "I don't think he meant to leave the door unlocked," she admitted. "He'd gone into the kitchen for something. And I ran. I don't even know how far. My legs felt like blocks of stone. I just ran." Her eyes darted between Rachel and the windows as if someone outside might be watching them even now. "I never went back to the market. And I never told anyone. Until now." Rachel exhaled slowly, her mind racing as she pieced together the implications. This wasn't just a man preying on women through deceit and illusion. This was systematic, calculated. He was drugging them, maybe worse. "Lucia," Rachel said carefully, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. "This is important. Did you notice anything? Anything specific in the house? A name, a photo, maybe something on the walls?" Lucia frowned, thinking hard. "There were no photos," she said. "Everything was sterile, cold, like a hotel, except for one thing." She hesitated, her brow furrowing. "He had a notebook." Rachel's pen froze mid-air. "A notebook? What was in it?" "I only saw it for a second," Lucia admitted. "But it looked like lists, names, numbers. I remember seeing my name written at the top of a page." She shivered visibly, gripping her cup as if it anchored her. "I swear I saw Maria's name too." Rachel felt her pulse quicken. Everything she had struggled to prove, every theory the police dismissed, was sitting in that notebook. Proof that Charles, or Richard, or whatever name he was hiding behind, wasn't just a shadowy figure with a gray truck. He was someone who kept track of his victims, someone who planned. "This is huge," Rachel said aloud, more to herself than to Lucia, but as she glanced at the terrified woman across the table, she softened. "Lucia, thank you for sharing this. I know how hard it must have been to come forward." Lucia nodded, though her face still carried the weight of fear. Do you think they'll believe me?" Rachel's jaw clenched. "I don't care if they don't. I'll make them." And with that, Rachel knew this confession would blow the case wide open. But as she walked out of the diner, leaving Lucia behind to wrestle with her lingering fear, one thought haunted her. If this man was keeping a notebook, how many names were written there? Names that would never find their way onto a flyer. The raid on the farm, and the horrifying discovery. The night air clung heavy to the officers' uniforms as their convoy moved silently down the narrow dirt road leading to the Shepherd farm. It was one of those eerily quiet October nights when even the crickets seemed to hold their breath. The moon cast pale beams through the overgrown trees that lined the property, their twisted branches clawing at the sky like skeletal hands. Officer Hale adjusted his utility belt and muttered to himself, his flashlight bouncing as he turned to Detective Grant. "You really think we're going to find something here?" Hale asked, his voice low but sharp. Grant, a seasoned investigator from the state police who had been brought in after Rachel Monroe's relentless digging turned up new evidence, didn't look at Hale. His eyes were fixed on the dim outline of the Shepherd farmhouse ahead. "I don't think, Hale," Grant replied curtly. "I know." The raid had been planned meticulously after weeks of painstaking work. Rachel's interview with Lucia had been the turning point. Her chilling account, especially the mention of Charles's notebook, lit a fire under an investigation that had been stalled for months. Grant had pored over every detail the journalist provided, cross-referencing missing persons reports, witness accounts, and what little evidence existed. The threads had led them here, to this forgotten piece of land on the outskirts of Millhaven. The farmhouse had come up in town records years earlier when it was purchased by a Charles Shepherd. No one knew much about him. He kept to himself, only ever venturing into town to refuel his truck or buy small supplies at the local hardware store. His neighbors, what few there were, described him as polite, but private. "The kind of man who disappears into the background," one neighbor had said. But now, as the convoy of police vehicles came to a stop just short of the property, the sense of unease was thick enough to choke on. Grant stepped out of his vehicle first, motioning toward the perimeter. "All right," he barked, his voice razor-sharp in the stillness. "Stay quiet. Stay sharp. I want teams circling the house. Watch your footing. If this guy's as careful as we think, he may have rigged something." Hale swallowed hard, gripping his flashlight and weapon as he fell into step. The other officers fanned out, their boots crunching against the dirt and fallen leaves. The farmhouse loomed ahead, its sagging roof and weather-beaten walls standing like a ghost against the backdrop of the dark woods. The closer they got, the more ominous it felt. Grant was the first to approach the front porch, his flashlight slicing through the shadows. The windows were covered with thick curtains, and the front door looked as though it hadn't been opened in years. But Grant had seen too many scenes like this to be fooled by appearances. With a nod to the officers behind him, he signaled for the door to be breached. "On three," whispered Sergeant Willis, the team leader stepping forward with the battering ram. "1, 2. The crash of the door splintering open echoed through the quiet night. The team surged inside, flashlights sweeping across the dusty interior. At first the house seemed almost ordinary. Dust-covered furniture, peeling wallpaper, and the faint smell of mildew filled the air. But it didn't take long for the team to realize something was very wrong. "There's no life here," Hale muttered under his breath, his flashlight catching cobwebs dangling like forgotten secrets in the corners. The kitchen was spotless, not in the way someone lived there every day, but in the way someone meticulously cleaned up after themselves. "Feels staged," Grant said, running a gloved hand along the counter, "as if he knew we'd get here eventually." It was when one of the officers found the door leading to the basement that the mood shifted completely. "Detective," came the urgent whisper, "you need to see this." Grant hurried over, flashlight in hand. He stared down at the narrow staircase leading into the darkness below. The air wafting up from the basement was heavy, damp, and metallic. It was the unmistakable scent of decay. "Body cams on," Grant ordered. "We're going down." The descent into the basement felt like stepping into the mouth of a beast. The stairs creaked under their weight, the air growing colder with each step. When their flashlights finally cut through the pitch-black space, the team froze. The room was vast and methodically arranged, like a twisted shrine to every nightmare the town had ignored for too long. The walls were lined with shelves, and upon the shelves sat rows of personal belongings, items that once belonged to the missing women. "Jesus Christ," Hale whispered, his voice trembling. His light passed over a delicate silver bracelet, a child's drawing folded neatly into a plastic bag, a pair of worn work boots. "Looks like trophies," Grant muttered grimly, his stomach churning. He kept pieces of them. In one corner of the room stood a large chest freezer. It was padlocked but humming softly, its mechanical hum the only sound in the suffocating silence of the basement. "Get the bolt cutters," Grant ordered. The lock gave way with a snap, and the lid creaked open. Inside was a sight no one in that basement would ever forget. Plastic bags sealed tightly, each labeled with a date. Some contained what appeared to be clothing, others something far worse. Hale stumbled back, his hand covering his mouth, trying and failing to keep his composure. "There's more!" one of the officers called out from another side of the basement. Grant walked over, his flashlight landing on a door at the far end of the room. A steel door, reinforced and completely out of place in what should have been the foundation of an old farmhouse. "Cut it open," he said, his voice cold and commanding, though the knot in his stomach told a different story. When they finally pried the door open, what they found behind it unveiled the full horror of Charles Shepard's actions. A hidden room, soundproofed and filled with restraints, tools, and journals stacked high on a makeshift desk. Rachel had been right. Charles kept records. Grant flipped through one of the notebooks, his gloved hands trembling slightly as he scanned the pages. Names, dates, and chillingly precise notes about each woman he had lured to this farm. Their fears, their hopes, details that painted them as human beings, but used against them like a hunter cataloging his prey. By the time the team emerged from the basement, they were no longer the same. The weight of what they had uncovered wasn't just evidence, it was a glimpse into the mind of a man who had turned vulnerability into an art form of predation. Outside, as the first rays of dawn broke over the tree line, Grant looked at Hale, his face pale beneath the streaks of dirt and sweat. "This place isn't just a scene, Hale," Grant said quietly. "It's a goddamn graveyard." As they secured the property and prepared to arrest Charles Shepard, who had been found hiding in a nearby barn, one thought hung heavily in the crisp morning air. How many more were out there, their names scrawled in those notebooks, waiting to be found, or forgotten? The cold-blooded confession of the suspect. The interrogation room felt smaller than usual, its pale yellow walls almost suffocating in their neutrality. Charles Shepard sat across the scarred metal table, his hands cuffed tightly though his body showed no signs of resistance. The fluorescent lights overhead cast unforgiving shadows across his lined face, emphasizing the gray in his hair and the calm demeanor that unnerved everyone in the precinct. This wasn't a man who looked like a monster, or at least not the kind of monster people in Millhaven had imagined. Detective Grant leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. His notebook sat closed in front of him, a conscious tactic to show Shepard they already knew everything they needed. Now it was time to make him say it. "You know why you're here?" Grant said, his voice steady and firm. Charles blinked, slowly raising his eyes from the table to meet the detective's. There was no fear in them, no emotion, just a patient expectancy. He looked like a man resigned to the inevitable. "I assume," Charles began, his voice soft and deliberate, "this is about the women." Grant felt a chill creep over his spine. It wasn't the words, it was the tone. Calm, mild, almost conversational. "That's right," Grant said, locking eyes with Shepard. "It's about the women. The ones you lured, drugged, and killed." Charles tilted his head slightly, as though he were weighing the accusation in his mind, deciding how much of it he agreed with. Finally he leaned back in his chair, the chain of his cuffs clinking softly against the table. "I'd be lying if I said I didn't expect this day to come," he admitted quietly. "Then start talking, Charles. Tell us everything," Grant demanded. Charles took a slow, measured breath. "I didn't hurt them. At least not at first," he said. "I helped them, you know? Gave them what they were looking for, hope, safety, a way out of whatever miserable lives they had come to Millhaven to escape, and they trusted me for that." He paused, an eerie smile ghosting his lips. "That's a powerful thing, Detective. Being trusted." Grant clenched his jaw. "You think trust gives you the right to take their lives?" "She's getting to you, isn't she?" "The journalist," Charles mused, ignoring the question entirely. "What's her name?" "Rachel. She saw this before you people did. Funny, isn't it, how a little reporter could connect the dots that an entire department couldn't? I mean, you had the evidence. You could have stopped me. Don't you dare shift this focus away from you," Grant snapped, his fist slamming against the table. "You're the one who did this, Charles. You're the one who hunted those women." The outburst didn't faze Charles. In fact, he seemed to take some quiet pleasure in the detective's rising anger. "They weren't hunted," Charles corrected softly. "That's such a crude way of saying it. I would say, chosen. Yes, that's more accurate. They were chosen, each one of them, carefully, deliberately. You see, when you learn how to look, you can see who's already broken, who life has already discarded. All I did was show them how right they were to feel hopeless." Grant's stomach turned. "You're telling me you picked your victims because they were vulnerable?" "Aren't we all in some way?" Charles said, his calm voice carrying an almost philosophical tone. "These women weren't people to anyone else, not really. They were invisible, undocumented, disposable. You know that as well as I do, Detective. Millhaven may act outraged now, but no one cared about their absence while they were alive. Not the town, not their employers, not you." Grant's hand balled into a fist, his nails biting into his palm. He had to keep his composure, no matter how much he wanted to slam this man right through the table. "You said you helped them. Did you help Maria Vasquez, Teresa Mendoza, Esperanza Ruiz?" Grant asked, his voice colder now. He stared at Charles, searching for a crack in that infuriatingly stoic expression. "What about them, Charles? What happened to them?" Charles exhaled through his nose, leaning forward slightly now. For the first time, his placid demeanor cracked, revealing something darker underneath, a kind of pride. His voice lowered to a whisper, forcing Grant to lean in closer. "Maria," he began, rolling the name over his tongue as if savoring it. "She was my favorite, I think. So full of hope, too much for her own good. It almost annoyed me at first. I thought it might make her harder to break." A pause. His lips twitched into the faintest smile. "But it didn't. All it took was kindness. Kindness can be the sharpest knife, Detective, if you know how to wield it." Grant forced himself to remain still. "And the others? Teresa, Esperanza, did you reel them in with kindness too?" Charles chuckled softly. "Each one was different. That's what made it fascinating. Teresa, she would have done anything for her daughter. That was easy. All I had to do was dangle a better paycheck in front of her and remind her of all the things she couldn't provide. Mothers will sacrifice anything for their children, even their common sense." Grant's jaw tightened. "You are a sick son of a bitch, you know that?" "They all had something," Charles continued as if Grant hadn't spoken. His voice became airy, almost nostalgic. "Something missing, something broken. Esperanza? She clung to the smallest glimpses of beauty in the world. She used to talk about the leaves. The fall colors here reminded her of Mexico. She thought working for someone like me would give her more free time to enjoy them. Poor thing never realized freedom was just an illusion." Grant slammed his fist on the table, making Charles flinch ever so slightly. "Enough of your twisted philosophies, Shepard. We know about the basement, the freezer, the goddamn trophies." "That was—" Charles hesitated almost thoughtfully. "Those were special. Reminders. Not of them, of course. They were reminders of me." "Explain," Grant growled. Charles leaned back, his cuffs clinking against the chair. "Do you know what happens when people like me die? What happens to the story? You'll write your statements. The press will run Rachel's article with some clever headline like, 'The Monster of Millhaven.' But then, people will forget. That's what humans do best, they forget." He exhaled slowly. "So, I kept something. A part of them. A part of me. Proof. I collected the evidence that the world would have ignored." Grant felt something tighten in his chest as Charles fell silent, his gaze settling somewhere beyond the room, as if he were already imagining the lasting legacy of his horrors. "You're going away for the rest of your life," Grant said finally, his voice raw with restrained rage. "You're never going to hurt another person again." Charles laughed softly, shaking his head. "You think locking me up means it's over? Detective, you can't stop what I started. There will always be someone like me, someone who looks past the surface and sees the cracks underneath." "Not in this town," Grant growled, standing up abruptly. He stormed toward the door, his pulse pounding in his ears. Behind him, Charles's voice echoed, calm and haunting. "Tell Rachel I said thank you," he called out, "for finding me before any of you ever bothered to look." The finality of the door slamming shut didn't silence the echoes of his words, or the chill they left in the room. The consequences and the wake-up call. The aftermath of Charles Shepard's arrest sent shockwaves far beyond the quiet streets of Millhaven. The gruesome horrors unearthed at the farmhouse were only the beginning of the reverberations that would shake the town, the state, and eventually, the nation. For years, Millhaven had prided itself on being an idyllic Midwestern community, a place where children played safely in tree-lined streets, and labor markets opened every morning like clockwork, unbothered and unnoticed. But now, the town was infamous, a name etched into American history associated not with warmth or simplicity, but with tragedy, negligence, and shattered lives. On the courthouse steps the day of Shepard's indictment, Rachel Monroe stood alongside several women from the immigrant community. The usually soft-spoken reporter who had first broken the story now found herself at the center of a media frenzy. Cameras flashed wildly as reporters shouted questions at her, questions that weighed heavy with accountability. "Rachel, how could so many women go missing without anyone noticing? And do you think Millhaven failed these victims?" Rachel's voice, tight with anger and exhaustion, rang out clearly. "The question isn't just whether Millhaven failed. It's whether this country, this system we live in, has. Charles Shepard thrived on silence. He thrived on indifference. And far too many people who should have cared, chose to look the other way." For the families of the victims, the consequences weren't impersonal ideas. They were deeply, heartbreakingly real. Diego Vasquez, Maria's son, stood before a packed courtroom during the sentencing hearing. His tear-streaked face, framed by the hard lines of loss and anger, turned toward Shepard as he spoke. "She was my mother," Diego said, his voice trembling but growing stronger with each word. "She crossed a border for me. She sacrificed her whole life so I'd have a shot at something better. And you—" Diego's voice broke for only a second as he glared at Shepard. "You took her. You didn't just take her life, you took our future, you took everything. And this whole town let you do it." His words stirred the audience. Some nodded, their heads down in acknowledgement of the harsh truth spoken aloud. Others turned away, unable to meet his gaze. Millhaven couldn't turn away entirely, though. The trial, which stretched on for months, forced everyone in the town to reckon with uncomfortable truths. Neighbors had walked past flyers of missing women for years, knowing deep down they'd never be found. Employers had turned down similar women for jobs, while secretly muttering phrases like, "not worth the risk," and "they'll just disappear anyway." Even the police had dismissed reports because the victims didn't fit the profile of someone worth chasing after. Public outcry began flooding the police department. Protests erupted outside City Hall, demanding accountability, an independent investigation, and reforms in how missing persons cases were handled. One protester held a sign that read, "We are not ghosts." Another sign bore the faces of missing women, Maria, Teresa, Esperanza, Ana. "How many more?" Rachel said to a reporter during the protest. "How many women like these are never found because no one bothers to look, because they aren't considered worth the resources?" Shepard exploited that indifference, and this town let him, this country let him. Beyond Millhaven, Shepard's crimes exposed a glaring flaw in the broader conversation about undocumented immigrants. Media headlines turned into national debates. Television panels pitted activists against politicians. Clips of Rachel's articles went viral, including her now iconic closing line, "If no one will protect the most vulnerable among us, then predators like Charles Shepard will keep coming, and they will win." In Washington, immigrant rights organizations seized on the momentum, putting pressure on legislators to address systemic failures in labor protections, not just for documented workers, but for everyone who found themselves vulnerable because of their status, especially women. One activist, speaking at a national rally, put it bluntly, "We don't think about what it means to have an economy built on the idea that certain people can be invisible. Millhaven is America's wake-up call, and it's too late for denial." Government committees began issuing formal recommendations. New hotlines aimed at protecting undocumented laborers were created. Law proposals to track missing persons more effectively, regardless of their immigration status, gained reluctant traction. For Millhaven itself, however, legislation meant far less than the irreversible loss it faced. The town's residents spoke in hushed tones about how Millhaven wasn't what it used to be. The diner that had once been packed with casual chatter now felt haunted. Its regulars spoke in fragments, their faces tinged with guilt for being the backdrop to absolute horror. When the labor market reopened after the incident, it too had changed. Fewer faces gathered. Many women, once desperate yet defenseless, now refused to take jobs from strangers. Margaret Cruz, who had spent over a decade working as a cleaner, shook her head tearfully at one reporter. "No job is worth it anymore," she said. "We're just prey to them, and they know it." A fence went up around the market shortly after, a pitiful attempt to create the illusion of order where there had once been trust. But trust was long gone. Charles Shepard, the man who had upended all of this, sat quietly during the trial. While emotions roared around him, while families wept and lawyers demanded justice, he remained composed, unfazed, even when the guilty verdict was read aloud. His final words in court chilled every room it touched. When asked if he felt remorse, Shepard glanced toward Rachel, smirking faintly before offering a simple reply, "I only did what the world allowed me to do." The consequences didn't stop with sentencing. Hollywood came knocking on Millhaven's door, eager to turn the tragedy into a true crime docuseries or blockbuster film. Producers promised sensitivity. Studios promised awareness. Many in the nation devoured the media coverage, not as a tale of injustice but as a piece of entertainment, a disturbing reflection of how tragedies became fodder for content. Rachel declined every attempt to involve her. While others capitalized, she quietly receded into her reporting, using the prominence she gained from the case to shed light on similarly ignored missing persons elsewhere. In interviews, her voice was clear and unwavering. Millhaven wasn't unique. It could happen anywhere, that's the problem. Even years later, what happened in Millhaven remains a sobering reminder of the consequences of silence. Schools now teach classes on local history, though many parents protest the darkness of such lessons. To Rachel, those complaints only reinforce the broader lesson the town ignored. "The cost of ignoring the vulnerable isn't just their lives," she once wrote as a reflection, "it's our humanity." Lessons from social indifference. The trial of Charles Shepard wasn't just a reckoning for the man who had preyed on Millhaven's most vulnerable. It was also a mirror, forcing the town and the country at large to confront an uglier truth: the role of indifference in enabling such horrors to unfold. Shepard's reign of terror thrived not in the shadows but in plain sight, carefully woven into a fabric of systemic complacency and prejudice. The tragedy of Millhaven wasn't isolated, it was the consequence of a society too willing to overlook the lives of those deemed invisible. Rachel Monroe, the journalist whose relentless reporting uncovered Shepard's crimes, had been saying it from the start. Back then, her warnings had been met with dismissive nods or outright disbelief. Now her voice became one of the loudest in the national conversation. "The hardest part to swallow," Rachel said during a televised segment after the sentencing, "is that Charles Shepard didn't need to hide. He didn't need secret corridors or elaborate cover stories. He operated in broad daylight because he knew the people he hurt, the women he disappeared, weren't considered worthy enough for anyone to go looking for them. We looked away. We let him." Millhaven was not the first town to bury its head in the sand, but its complacency had been uniquely glaring. The flyers of missing women had been torn down or ignored, the whispers among the immigrant community dismissed as rumor, the cries for help drowned out by bureaucracy and prejudice. The police department in particular came under intense scrutiny for its failure to act on early reports. Rachel's reporting highlighted several chilling examples. Luz, Maria Vasquez's roommate, who begged officers to take Maria's disappearance seriously. "Every time I went back to the police station, they'd just put another sticky note on some board in the back," Luz had told Rachel. "They didn't even write down her last name the first time. Teresa Mendoza's best friend, who had repeatedly told neighbors Teresa wouldn't have abandoned her daughter, only to be met with, "These people, don't they move around a lot? Don't get attached." Calls to action from local advocates were brushed aside with familiar refrains. "There's no manpower. She probably left on her own. There's nothing suspicious." These excuses became, as Rachel famously described them in her article, the slogans of structural neglect. James Holcomb, a sociology professor who became an outspoken advocate for immigrant rights during Shepard's trial, offered a sobering analysis in a New York Times op-ed. "When we talk about the invisible, we're not describing some superpower, some stealth inherited by these women," Holcomb wrote. "We're describing erasure. They were invisible because society chose not to see them. Being undocumented made them unworthy of protection. Being women made them unworthy of safety. And being poor made them unworthy of resources. It wasn't indifference, it was intentional neglect." The article struck a chord particularly with immigrant communities who knew all too well what it felt like to be ignored until tragedy struck. At rallies inspired by Rachel's reporting, women held signs reading, "We deserve to be seen, and our pain is real." Stories began to pour out, not only about Millhaven, but about other small towns across the nation where exploitation and disappearances went unnoticed. One rally speaker, a woman named Mariella, shared her own harrowing account. "I used to work at a diner just like the one in Millhaven. Same kind of town. One of my co-workers, Anna, we never saw her after she left with that man who promised her a better paying job. I told my manager. You know what he told me? 'Not your business, Mariella.' They say these things don't happen, but I lived it. Until they tell us we're not your business anymore, this will never stop." What happened in Millhaven also exposed how deeply the cracks in systemic support ran. Advocates pointed at how the nation's labor systems, particularly those reliant on undocumented workers, created an ecosystem rife for exploitation. Without legal protections, the women who disappeared in Millhaven were placed firmly in danger, not just by Shepard, but by the mechanics of the society they labored in. Juan Rojas, an attorney who specializes in immigrant advocacy, was one of the first to push for major legislative changes in response to Millhaven's tragedy. "When you build an economy based on invisible people, you're asking for this to happen," he said during a press briefing. "When they can't call the police, when they can't rely on the systems that are supposed to protect all of us, they are left completely on their own." To predators like Shepard, these women weren't victims, they were opportunities. But the lessons of Millhaven weren't just national, they hit deeply personal for the town itself. Residents, haunted by their silence and complicity, struggled to come to terms with how they had contributed to the perfect storm Charles Shepard exploited. At town meetings, tensions ran high as lifelong citizens debated whether or not they bore responsibility for what had happened. "We didn't kill those women!" shouted one man during a particularly heated meeting at the town hall. "We didn't force them into that monster's truck!" "You didn't hang up their flyers either," shot back a woman from the back of the room. "You didn't ask questions. When Maria disappeared, I remember your wife saying, 'Oh, she's probably in another state.' You helped this happen." Rosa Morales, a former housekeeper and one of Shepard's almost victims who had escaped his trap, offered a clearer perspective when she spoke at that same meeting. Her face lined with the scars of fear and exhaustion, she stood in front of the packed room and said simply, "You all saw us working in your restaurants, cleaning your houses, raising your kids, and you thought nothing about us. You told yourselves, it's not my problem. Well, now it is your problem. What happened to those women? It's all of our problem." Rachel Monroe wrote passionately in the weeks that followed, detailing the lessons Millhaven could no longer afford to disregard. Her most widely read op-ed offered perhaps the most damning assessment of not just Millhaven, but the country at large. This isn't about Charles Shepard. It never was. He managed to unleash horrors on these women, yes, but only because the systems designed to protect them failed so completely. A predator can only thrive in the quiet, in the shadows that indifference creates. The silence of Millhaven, the silence of our nation, that's what killed these women. That's what created monsters like Charles Shepard, and until we fix that silence, we haven't done a damn thing. The lessons from Millhaven's tragedy were hard to swallow. For some, they became rallying cries for change. For others, they remained reminders of guilt and the high cost of looking the other way. One sign from a protest outside City Hall summed up the painful truth bluntly: "Indifference is the killer you didn't see coming." Other secrets waiting to be uncovered. Even after Charles Shepard's arrest, the unsettling shadow he cast over Millhaven lingered. The farmhouse and its haunting basement told part of the story, but but it was clear to investigators, journalists, and the community that there were still mysteries buried in Shepard's twisted past. Rachel Monroe, whose relentless reporting had exposed the glaring failures of the town and its systems, didn't stop with his capture. For her, the question that loomed largest above all was, what haven't we found yet? It began with the notebooks. The detailed chronicles Shepard meticulously wrote in his cold, sterile basement were harrowing enough by themselves. Each entry was numbered, dated, and filled with eerily detached observations about the women he lured and manipulated. Yet, as investigators combed through the dozens of pages left behind, more questions began to emerge than answers. The notebooks contained 52 names. Only 8 were tied back to the women investigators already knew: Maria Vasquez, Teresa Mendoza, Esperanza Ruiz, and others. 8 lives that had gone unnoticed or written off by a disinterested system. But what of the remaining 44 names? Detective Grant, who had spearheaded the raid on Shepard's farm, stood beside a cluttered table in the evidence room, staring at the rows of notebooks laid out in crisp clinical order. Each cover was devoid of labels, a chilling testament to the deliberate compartmentalization of Shepard's crimes. "So what are we looking at here?" Hale asked from across the room, his fingers nervously drumming against a folder of crime scene photos. "You're saying there could be more of them, out there, missing?" Grant's brow furrowed as he leafed through one of the notebooks again, his gloved hands careful not to disturb the fragile evidence. "I'm saying some of them could still be alive," Grant replied, his voice gravelly from exhaustion but tinged with an undeniable intensity. "We've only scratched the surface, and we don't know where that surface ends." Hale hesitated, his usual cavalier demeanor swallowed entirely by the enormity of the situation. "Alive? You think this guy was keeping them somewhere? For what? Why?" "That's the thing," Grant said, shaking his head. "Some of these names are older, years old, back when he first bought the farm. Look at this one, Madeline, 2009. That's almost a decade before Maria disappeared in 2018. Hale ran a hand over his face, his voice lowering. "Jesus, what if he's been doing this even longer than we thought?" The discovery of the notebooks reignited fears within the immigrant community. Many began to wonder if Shepard's crimes had extended beyond Millhaven itself. In interviews, Rachel Monroe spoke to families from neighboring towns, even neighboring states, who believed Shepard could have preyed upon women in their communities. One woman, Elena Garcia, approached Rachel during a protest just weeks after the trial. Her eyes were wide, her hands clutching a faded photo of her younger sister Pilar. "She disappeared in 2014, Elena said, barely able to steady her voice. "Houston, Texas. She went to meet a man about a housekeeping job. A nice man, she told me. Good pay, she said." Elena looked at the ground for a moment before her voice cracked. "Her name, it's in his notebook. Pilar Garcia, please tell me you'll find her." Rachel stared at the photo, her heart sinking under the unbearable weight of another name, another face tied to Shepard's list. "I'll try, Elena," Rachel said softly, but with determination. "I won't stop asking until we know the truth." The deeper investigators dug, the more evidence pointed to Shepard possibly having connections to others, perhaps accomplices, people who knowingly or unknowingly enabled his crimes. This theory came into focus as Grant reviewed Shepard's truck logs. "Look at this," Grant muttered late one evening as he pored over a map of Millhaven and the surrounding counties. The truck's GPS history showed repeated trips to an outlying storage facility just 20 miles south of the farm. Oddly, the trips often occurred in the dead of night. "What's he keeping there?" Hale asked, legitimately dreading the answer. Grant didn't respond, instead picking up his coat. "There's only one way to find out." The storage facility was a chilling reminder of how ordinary places could conceal extraordinary evil. The unassuming rows of garage-style storage units stretched out under the fluorescent hum of overhead lights. Grant and a team of officers spent hours searching the unit registered to Shepard under a different name, one of dozens of aliases investigators believed he had used. Inside, they found a collection of personal items, clothes, IDs, immigration papers, all belonging to women who had never been reported as missing because no one had realized they were gone. Then, in a corner, a single videotape marked with nothing but the word "fall." Rachel Monroe was one of the few granted permission to view parts of the recovered media. Though much of it was handed over to law enforcement for evidence, Rachel described her experience in a chilling article. The tape begins with autumn leaves scattering across a dirt path. The camera follows the movements of shoes, small worn shoes caked with dust and mud. A voice behind the camera speaks, calmly but with a chilling detachment. "It's always beautiful this time of year," the man says. "But beauty fades, doesn't it?" It's unclear who's behind the camera, though the voice is unmistakably Shepard's. The tape continues with bouts of silence, the sound of leaves crunching underfoot, and the occasional unnerving whispers from behind the lens. There are no women pictured in this tape, but the implication of the voice, of his control over this desolate place, is clear. "You'll understand one day," the voice says as the camera pans abruptly upward toward an empty sky. "Why they stay, why they always stay." The meaning of the tape, and whether it hinted at additional victims, perhaps buried somewhere in the woods, left investigators sick with uncertainty. In the following weeks, cadaver dogs scoured the area near Shepard's farm and the surrounding properties, but no additional remains were conclusively found. Even as Rachel pressed forward with her reporting, the thought gnawed at her. How many more women had crossed paths with Shepard and never even made it to the farmhouse? How many lives were erased so thoroughly that even his records couldn't account for them? And then there were the names on those yellowed pages, some with chillingly precise footnotes like obedient or unfit. Shepard's scribbled judgment of who was worth keeping and who wasn't cast a blackened shadow over the notion of how some lives were valued. For Rachel, for Grant, for the people of Millhaven and beyond, the same question pulsed in whispers and open conversations alike. Was Charles Shepard working alone? And more hauntingly, what other monsters were out there hiding behind ordinary trucks, soft voices, and kind-looking eyes? Waiting, watching, choosing. A wake-up call for marginalized workers. The haunting tragedy of Millhaven and the horrifying revelations of Charles Shepard's crimes did more than devastate a small town. It sent shockwaves far and wide, exposing vulnerabilities that society had deliberately ignored for years. At the heart of these revelations was a painful truth. Marginalized workers, particularly undocumented immigrants, women, and the poor, were being preyed upon not only by predators like Shepard, but also by the indifference of the systems that were supposed to protect them. Rachel Monroe, the journalist who brought the injustices to light, was unrelenting in her message. Speaking at a national symposium on labor justice, she addressed a sobering audience. The women Shepard targeted weren't just victims of his depravity, they were victims of a system that left them completely exposed. We don't just let people fall through the cracks, we carve those cracks into every structure we build, and then we feign shock when tragedies like Millhaven happen. For the immigrant workers at the heart of Shepard's crimes, his arrest was both a victory and a painful reminder of how many warning signs had been ignored. Take Luz Robles, Maria Vasquez's roommate, who had practically begged the Millhaven police to take Maria's disappearance seriously. "I went back over and over, and it was always the same response," Luz later recalled at a public forum about the case. "Adults don't have to check in," they'd say, or "she probably ran away." But Maria wasn't like that. They didn't care. To them, we're temporary, replaceable. Our pain doesn't matter. Rachel's reporting struck a nerve not only in Millhaven but across the nation. It uncovered what millions of workers, especially undocumented laborers, already knew. The people society depends on for cheap labor, kept on the fringes without protections, are often invisible. Juanita Alvarado, a domestic worker in California, was among the hundreds of women who came forward to share their own harrowing experiences after the Millhaven case. "I've had employers lock me in their houses," she said during an advocacy rally. "I've been followed to my car after work by men who think I'll never report them because I'm undocumented. And they're right, because who would listen?" Juanita's voice cracked as she added, "When I read about those poor women in Millhaven, I saw myself. That could have been me. That could have been any of us." The parallels were undeniable. The fear, the isolation, the lack of recourse. Workers like Maria Vasquez and Teresa Mendoza had gone to labor markets with hope in their hearts, believing the promises of good pay and steady work, only to vanish into thin air. Across the country, labor markets, particularly those frequented by immigrant workers, became symbols of both opportunity and danger. "You roll the dice every morning you stand at those markets," one construction worker told the Herald. "You don't know who's pulling up in that truck. Could be someone offering an honest day's pay, or it could be someone like him." Rachel wrote powerfully about the inherent risks in her viral editorial following Shepard's conviction. The undocumented population in this country isn't invisible by accident. They've been forced into invisibility. Shepard's crimes are proof of how deadly it can be to spend your life hiding in the shadows. The fallout led to unprecedented organizing efforts among domestic workers and day laborers to demand protections. In cities across the country, Rallies were held under banners that read, "We are not disposable," and "Every worker matters." Numerous speakers were undocumented workers themselves, unafraid to share their stories in public forums despite the risks. One such speaker, Anahi Cortez, summarized the collective fear and anger of her peers. It didn't matter to Shepherd that the women in Millhaven had dreams, or families, or faith. They were workers to him, numbers, and because the law treats us the same, as workers first and people second, it handed us straight to him. The political response was swift but fractured, as legislators began wrestling with uncomfortable truths about the nation's economy. One senator summed up the dilemma starkly. Undocumented labor is the backbone of industries like agriculture, housekeeping, and construction, but it's also where exploitation thrives. We can't keep turning a blind eye to the abuses these workers face, or tragedies like Millhaven will keep happening. Proposals began to surface for locally protected worker identification systems for day labor markets, ensuring no one could hire without logging the job and confirming the worker's safety afterward. Advocacy groups also pushed for hotlines where undocumented workers could report suspicious activity without fear of immigration enforcement, the latter becoming a fiercely debated topic on both sides of the political spectrum. Juan Rojas, an attorney who specializes in immigrant rights, spoke passionately at a Senate hearing. Millhaven wasn't just a failure of morality, it was a failure of policy. When you strip people of protections, you don't just leave them vulnerable to predators like Charles Shepherd, you create predators like Charles Shepherd. At the local level, labor markets in small towns began implementing safeguards. Some communities installed surveillance cameras around labor stops. Others designated hiring overseers to track who was picking up workers and for what purpose. But real change came from within the immigrant community itself. Rosa Morales, one of the few women who managed to escape Shepherd's trap, founded a nonprofit called Valor Y Vaz, Courage and Voice, aimed at providing education and resources to immigrant workers. Every woman who disappeared in Millhaven trusted a promise that shouldn't have been dangerous to trust, Rosa said during the organization's first national conference. We have to look out for each other, because no one else will. The tragedy of Millhaven taught us how easily hopeful people can become prey. Now our job is to make sure that never happens again. Rachel Monroe continued to shine a spotlight on this issue, refusing to let Millhaven fade into just another forgotten tragedy. Speaking on a nationally broadcast panel, she stated, "I'm not interested in pretending Shepherd was some once-in-a-lifetime monster. His crimes were horrific, but the conditions that allowed him to operate, those are everywhere. Whenever we treat one group of people like they're less worthy of safety, less worthy of visibility, or less worthy of rescue, we create the perfect environment for another Charles Shepherd to thrive." She paused before driving home her final point. The wake-up call of Millhaven isn't just about workers or even immigration policy, it's about humanity, how easily we decide who matters, and how dangerous that indifference can be. It is clear the Millhaven tragedy was more than just an atrocity. It became a rallying cry, a demand for a nation to stop pretending it didn't know what was happening in the shadows of its labor force. Some answered that call with reform, advocating relentlessly for structural changes to ensure no one would ever be that vulnerable again. Others, however, quietly returned to their routines, uncomfortable with the spotlight cast on the unspoken agreements that kept their lifestyles intact. As Rosa once said at a rally, her voice rising above a sea of cheering workers demanding equality, "We've seen what indifference can cost. Now the question is, how much longer are we willing to pay the price?"